The views expressed in this course are those of the professor and do not necessarily reflect the position or policy of the teaching company LLC, the U.S. Naval War College, the U.S. Navy, the U.S. Department of Defense, or the U.S. government.
At the turn of the 20th century, America's automobile industry was a lot like aristocratic warfare in ancient China. A few thousand highly skilled craftsmen meticulously hand-built spectacular objects of great symbolic importance. Those early automobiles were unique and precious, but the manufacturing system was completely inefficient. Henry Ford saw these innate inefficiencies and how to correct them. In the process, he fundamentally transformed industrial manufacturing and with it, the American way of life. Ford also demonstrated an instinctive knack for two of the core concepts in the art of war: command and method, or in other words, leadership and organization. We saw in Lecture 3 that the art of war is trying to invent a new leadership model, one appropriate to the emerging realities of ancient Chinese warfare. Those new realities required commanders to be both brilliant strategists and ruthlessly effective organizers. Lacking either, a commander was unlikely to succeed. But as the Henry Ford example illustrates, the Sun Tzu's leadership model isn't limited to warfare. Today, we'll examine the concepts of command and method, first as they're developed in the Sun Tzu itself, and then as they're exemplified by the early success of the Ford Motor Company. You'll recall that the Chinese title of The Art of War has 4 characters, Sun Tzu Bing Fa, and you'll remember that the third character, Bing, means military. In fact, the word literally refers to an edged weapon, like a sword or a halberd. By extension, it refers to a mass of infantry armed with such standardized weapons. But by even further extension, it refers to the entire military institution. We've also seen that by the 4th century BCE, this institution's entire purpose was putting tens, if not hundreds of thousands of men into the field, fed, armored, and armed with hundreds of thousands of those edged weapons and later crossbows, produced on an industrial scale. In this sense, Bing is a weighty concept, not least because it embodied the radically transformed way of war in ancient China. What had once been an affair involving highly ritualized battles between a few thousand chariot-mounted aristocrats had turned into the greatest affair of the state: a contest between mass infantry armies of 100,000 or more, supported by complicated logistics. This reimagining of Bing, the military, in turn required reimagining 2 connected concepts: command and what method, Zhang and Fa. Both terms are introduced in Chapter 1, where the art of war lays out the process for gauging the strengths and weaknesses of 2 belligerents. Ultimately, this net assessment involves 5 fundamental characteristics of a state, or by extension, of an organization. First, how morally cohesive it is. Second, its environmental conditions. Third, its physical geography. Fourth and fifth on this list are command and method. As such, command and method represent both potential strengths as well as weaknesses of states and organizations. So let's look first at the key components of effective command. Also in Chapter 1, a commander's 5 qualities are listed as wisdom, sincerity, benevolence, courage, and discipline. When we talked about benevolence, I pointed to its distinct meaning. It's essentially serving a greater good, putting the survival and prosperity of the state ahead of personal ambitions or even ethical considerations. But what about the other 4? Well, I don't think it's a coincidence that the list begins with wisdom, which we might also translate as intellect or comprehension. The art of war puts a premium on the cognitive and computational skills of the commander. After all, the first discussion of command comes in the middle of a chapter on assessments. It's the general who bears responsibility first for assessing the strengths and weaknesses of each side in the looming conflict, and second for manipulating the scales to maximize their comparative competitive advantage, their sure. And there's that interesting passage at the end of chapter 1, right? Remember that? Casting yarrow stalks. I think that line really amplifies the importance of cognitive abilities. Ancient China was a very traditional and superstitious place, and many people thought their fate lay in the hands of the gods. That's why part of the battle preparations involved divination, asking the gods who was going to win. As I said, the Sun Tzu mocks that tradition by arguing that a battle's outcome doesn't depend on the gods, but on human agency, specifically on a leader who can weigh and manipulate the scales of victory by their effective use of their own intellect. The next quality, sincerity, is a somewhat counterintuitive concept. An emphasis on sincerity seems out of place in a book that praises deception and flat-out dishonesty. But we need to look at this as more about sincerity and credibility in the way a commander leads their organization. Policies and regulations, once implemented, must be followed to the letter. Think about how the uneven application of standards can damage morale and effectiveness in your workplace. Or if you're a parent, how important consistency is when dealing with your kids. If a leader is inconsistent, they'll lose credibility with the rank and file. So we have wisdom, sincerity, and benevolence. The ideal commander's fourth quality is courage. This isn't physical courage. The Sun Tzu in general doesn't lead from the front. Rather, they orchestrate the battle from the relative safety of a command tower. Courage here is more moral courage, steadfastness in decision-making, the courage to overrule the sovereign, and perhaps to choose an unpopular course of action when the consequences of a more popular course of action could be dire. Finally, we have discipline or strictness. This has both personal and an organizational angle. A leader must be personally strict and disciplined in their own bearing. This strictness can impress and motivate subordinates. But more importantly, it prevents the general from showing any sign of weakness that can be exploited by the enemy. Strictly holding your own counsel and your tongue also prevents word of your plans from leaking out to foe and friend alike. The general is both a processor of information and a source of information. Wisdom allows you to know the enemy. Discipline prevents the enemy from knowing you. At the organizational level, discipline relates to sincerity. Strictness and credibility when dealing with subordinates creates a more disciplined and responsive organization. Credibly articulating standards must be paired with their strict and disciplined implementation. Given the highly controversial nature of its argument, especially its denigration of the heroic warrior ethos, it's not surprising that the art of war goes to some rhetorical extremes when talking about discipline and obedience. Much of the time, Sun Tzu's soldiers seem as if they've been reduced to a herd of mindless machines. And while we need to remember that human beings can never be turned into automatons, discipline is essential. In today's military, we want smart and creative mid-level officers. But every officer still starts off with basic training. That involves intensive discipline and an emphasis on order. The same applies to the way many corporations train future managers. So the Sun Tzu's superior general, sometimes translated as clever combatant, possesses these 5 key leadership traits. But as with many things in the art of war, there's an elegant duality at work. All 5 virtues of the general have countervailing vices, which are enumerated at the end of chapter 8. A general who has a death wish, excessive courage that is, can be killed. One who fears death, one who lacks courage, can be captured. A general who is rash and prone to anger is easily insulted. One who obsesses over their reputation can be embarrassed. And the leader who cares too much about the safety of their own people can be troubled. Remember that this book is seeking to create a new standard of leadership. Success or failure of an organization depends on the quality of its leadership. In other words, a leader's vices are not just personal foibles, they have far-reaching implications. Adversaries can exploit these vices to disrupt an entire organization. By now, I think that you're beginning to see that it's impossible to discuss command without also saying something about method. In fact, if you take only one thing away from this course, it should be this. None of the core concepts in the art of war can be treated in isolation. They are all parts of a greater whole. But since it's pedagogically useful to highlight one term at a time, let's now shift our focus and look more closely at method. What are the elements of that Chinese word, fa, which I translate as method? More specifically, what are the elements of the bingfa, the military methods? As we've seen, the rapid expansion of armies in ancient China meant that the hereditary warrior aristocracy with their chariots and longbows was being supplanted by conscript infantry armed with mass-produced edged weapons and later crossbows. The Chinese word for general, zhang, is literally a hand grasping something. Traditionally, command in war, as we've seen, meant little more than grasping the reins of the lead chariot. So a general is basically the guy who led a chariot army into battle. But the art of war reimagines the concept, command, as something very different. Master Sun's general isn't the bravest warrior, they're the best organizer. And because of their organizational skill, are no longer just the guy wielding the reins of a single chariot. They have the ability to wield the entire military organization, that Bing, like a single weapon. As a result, the general's personal qualities, their intelligence, sincerity, and courage won't amount to anything if they don't have a sharp and responsive military instrument in their hands. To create that sharp and responsive weapon, the Sun Tzu lays out very stringent methods of discipline and organization. Essentially, method in the art of war is the process by which a mass of ignorant farm boys is transformed into a responsive military instrument. Or to put it differently, method is what allows the general, the zhang, to lead 10,000 soldiers just as easily as they might lead a single one by the hand. In this light, let's think back to that story about Sun Tzu and the concubines at the court of King He. I've actually been to the spot there that this supposedly took place, and I gotta tell you, that story is pretty over the top. But I think there are some potential lessons. One, discipline and obedience are everything. When discipline fails the first time, Sun Tzu restates the commands and the appropriate maneuvers. In other words, he clarifies the method. But because the concubines fail to understand the seriousness of the occasion, they cannot follow the methods, and as a result, Sun Tzu cannot command them. He cannot wield them as a disciplined and effective instrument. When the two senior concubines pay the ultimate price for their lack of discipline, the remaining women carry out the methods as instructed. And Sun Tzu is able to command them, but the king is not happy. When Sun Tzu is about to behead his two favorite concubines, He tries to stay the executioner's hand, but Sun Tzu counters that his authority in military matters is absolute. What's the lesson? Well, a general whose hands are tied by their ruler cannot wield the military as effectively as a commander who is unfettered. And yet there's a third lesson. For an aristocrat, war was intensely personal. For Master Sun, the personal qualities of individual soldiers are irrelevant. The concubines in this story are the polar opposite of warrior aristocrats. They're soft and feminine, not hard and macho. In fact, they're more like the illiterate peasants that are going to make up these new armies in ancient China. They're simply inputs of labor into the mechanism of war. It's not that far from this approach to war to the type of mechanical dehumanization that came with industrial mass production in the 19th and 20th centuries. In any case, based on my reading, there are four key elements under Master Sun's method header. The first is organization. The Western archetype of ancient military organization is ancient Rome. Rome's armies were comprised of legions. Each legion was divided into 10 infantry cohorts. Each cohort divided into several centuries, and contrary to expectations, each 80-man century consisted of 10 8-man squads. A legion takes an undifferentiated mass of humanity and breaks it into manageable units, creating a hierarchical and regimented organization. But because the system is standardized and modular, the whole organization is inherently flexible. The Roman legions also had specialized auxiliaries like cavalry, artillery, and engineers. They could operate independently or in coordination with the main line. modern organizations follow similar patterns, and they also need to factor in multiple capabilities, such as a sales force and the HR department. Each organization ultimately needs the right mix of capabilities in general and the flexibility to reconfigure them to meet specific challenges. The second element under method is the guandao, literally the way or Dao of officials. This refers to both the command structure overlaid on an organization and the specific staffing decisions that fall to the commander. Organization starts the process of creating the right tool for the right job. The guandao makes sure that the right people are in the right positions to optimize the strengths of the organization. One area where the Sun Tzu general maintains the right to stiff-arm his ruler is in the realm of personnel decisions. We see this at the end of chapter 3. One of the greatest misfortunes a king can visit upon his own army is interfering in personnel and administrative decisions. The last thing you want is a king who puts his nephews or cousins into leadership positions. It's bad for morale, bad for effectiveness, and bad for the organization's credibility. You might remember Wang Laboratories. It was a highly successful corporation under the leadership of its founder, Dr. An Wang. But Dr. Wang insisted that his son Fred take over the company, first as head of R&D and then as president. Under Fred's stewardship, the company's morale and reputation both declined precipitously. In many ways, Wang Laboratories never recovered from that all-too-personal of personnel decisions. As part of organization and guandao, I should also mention the art of war's emphasis on properly motivating subordinates. At times, rewards are appropriate. At others, the threat of punishment is a powerful motivator. An effective leader really needs to know their subordinates to gauge which form of motivation fits each occasion. The third element of method is a subject that every military professional and many corporate veterans will immediately understand: logistics. A dramatic expansion in logistics was central to ancient China's military revolution. Much of Chapter 2 of this book is devoted to issues like finance and supply. That's not surprising, right? It's trying to explode heroic notions about war and command. If you want to take all the excitement out of a subject, beat your readers over the head with mundane financial details. Our authors are essentially commodifying conflict. In war, the side with the longer purse, the side best able to maintain a high level of material support to its military forces, that side usually prevails. But the art of war throws a wrinkle into logistics. You get your arms, armor, and initial food rations from your own storehouses. But after that, your food supplies should ideally be taken from the enemy. That simplifies your supply chains, but it has the added benefit of magnifying the material stresses on your competition. If we applied that to the business world, think of a company that steals away its competitors' suppliers. In essence, that company is feeding itself while starving the competition. A military example is Sherman's march to the sea from the American Civil War, right? Where living off the land rather than fighting battles was the main strategy. Defeating the Confederacy by undermining its food supply. The Sun Tzu is advising economic warfare. Hardly heroic, but definitely effective. Finally, I'd point to communication as the fourth element of any effective method. While not explicitly identified under this specific header, communications permeate this section of the book. Logistics is all about maintaining lines of communication. In addition, the clarity and precision of orders and regulations is another form of communications. At Gettysburg, for example, a big cause of Lee's defeat was his inability to communicate clearly with his generals. Those subordinates had too much discretion and failed to seize key opportunities to overwhelm the Union Army. And as we'll see in a subsequent lecture, both espionage and deception are forms of communication. They are critical means for gaining knowledge of the competition and transmitting deceptive misinformation to them. In addition, a commander like Norman Schwarzkopf in the First Persian Gulf War may also communicate directly with their adversary. They might send emissaries to parley and negotiate a ceasefire. As a result, a general needs to be sensitive to the nuances of the words and actions of those emissaries. If they're meek and obsequious, they're probably planning something. If they talk tough and bluster, they're probably afraid of something. If you've ever been in a business negotiation, I'm sure you'll appreciate Sun Tzu's wisdom on this point. And of course, command and control in the heat of battle hinges on effective communications, especially an effective communications system. In ancient Chinese warfare, gongs and drums and a complex system of flags and banners made it possible for a general to precisely coordinate the actions of a vast army. But as we all know, the more dependent you are on communications and the more strategically vital your communications become, the more vulnerable you are to having your network hacked. Maintaining information security verges on an obsession in the art of war. This obviously involves keeping the enemy in the dark, but also making sure that your own people only know what they need to know and nothing more. In chapter 13, for example, we're told that if your spy ring, your spy network, is compromised, everyone involved with the particular mission that's been exposed should be put to death. That way they can't reveal anything about the larger communications network. So we've covered a lot of ground in this discussion of command and method, and we haven't really touched on topics like maneuver or combat. But that's because this book is about more than war and combat, the clash of armies. It's also concerned with institutions and organizations and new standards of leadership. Skill in battle is only a manifestation of much larger processes going on behind the scenes, especially the abilities of the commander and the methods they employ to hone a disciplined and responsive organization. So when we think about the art of war as a guide for competition, we realize that it's also a guide for preparing an organization for that competition, and perhaps preparing it so well that its organizational strength and focus overawes the competition. Indeed, overawes them to such an extent that they simply give up without a fight. To paraphrase from The Art of War, the army honed with the best methods and wielded by the most skilled commander, what's called the army of the hegemon king. Well, when that army is poised to attack a rival, the rival is unable to assemble their army, and their allies will abandon them. Ultimately, then, the key to winning without fighting, achieving your objectives without spending unnecessary blood and treasure, lies first in the quality of your leadership and the awesome reputation of your organization, which brings me back to Henry Ford. Ford essentially created a corporation that embodied all the great strengths of a Sun Tzuian approach to leadership and organization. And as a result, the Ford Motor Company came to dominate the global automobile industry. The Art of War tells us that the military is the greatest affair of the state. Because of the vision, leadership, and organizational brilliance of Henry Ford, the automobile, automotive culture, and the automotive industry became defining features of 20th century America, the greatest affair of our state. How did this come about, and why is it a Sun Tzuian story? I start off by saying that the US auto industry at the turn of the 20th century was a lot like aristocratic warfare in ancient China. Like the arms, armor, and chariots of those aristocratic warriors, the first generation of American cars were built exclusively for the very wealthy. The cars themselves were individually designed and custom built for an American aristocracy. A paint job alone might take months. Their owners would then treat them as objects less of convenience and utilitarian transport, but as ritual symbols of their wealth and status. Henry Ford took a far more utilitarian approach to the car. To Ford, it was a tool, a practical and economic tool with no glamour or glory, and cars could be built in practical and economical ways. As such, Ford focused on simple, standardized models that could be quickly and cheaply assembled. The end result, the Model T, was inexpensive, practical, easy to drive, and easy to fix. Ford wasn't really inventing anything new at this point. He's primarily combining existing technologies and techniques in a mass production scheme that optimized productive capacity. Ford also appreciated logistics and created a vertically integrated organization that guaranteed predictable inputs of raw materials, supply chains. You can see the parallels here to organizational and manpower changes taking place in ancient China. Like the mass infantry army that the Sun Tzu general commands, Ford employed relatively unskilled labor, not expensive master coach builders, and approached that labor supply as just another input like steel or rubber. Each worker arrayed in formation along the assembly line had a simple and repetitive task, a task that could be quickly mastered. But the more they did that task, the faster and better they became over time. But just like the Sun Tzu's clever combatant, Ford appreciated that his manpower needed motivation. So in 1914, Ford implemented the $5 a day wage and bonus system. He gave that to his assembly line workers. That was double the industry average. It was a bold move that incentivized hard work. It increased productivity and created an entirely new market for Ford's cars, auto workers themselves. So by combining brilliant leadership, i.e. command, and incredibly efficient organization, method, Ford pummeled his competition. In 1914 alone, the number of cars that 15,000 Ford employees produced was greater than the total production of all the other major car makers combined, even though they collectively employed 4 times as many workers as Ford. By the 1920s, a brand new Model T was selling for less than $300. That's down from an initial price of $850. And roughly 1/2 of all the cars on the planet were Model Ts. Outside the company, Ford lobbied governments to improve American infrastructure and pushed the oil industry to increase the number of service stations. That made Ford products that much more useful, practical, and ultimately indispensable. So as much as Ford guaranteed logistical flows into his manufacturing process, he also made sure that his consumers were assured logistical support like gas, tires, and spare parts once they were out on the road. As a leader, therefore, Ford had both a vision and the courage to carry it out, like the Sun Tzu's ideal commander. He was strict in his personal habits and intensely engaged in improving his organization's efficiency. He also had the Sun Tzu's unique brand of benevolence, strategic generosity in pursuit of comparative advantage, and above all, profit. And yet at the same time, Ford could be a ruthless and capricious authoritarian. In addition, while he was justifiably obsessed with efficiency and output, over time he became almost exclusively focused on efficiency and stubbornly refused to adapt to changing conditions and the changing nature of the very market that he had created. In our second lecture, we saw that the Bingfa, or military methods invented in the Chinese state of Qi, quickly migrated to other Chinese states, where they were tweaked and improved upon, and where leadership was often bolder and more innovative. Something similar happens in the American auto industry. By the 1920s, Ford's mass production methods have been adopted by other automakers, most notably by General Motors. Under the leadership of arch-tweakers like Pierre DuPont and Alfred Sloan, GM assessed Ford's strengths and weaknesses, just as the first chapter of Sun Tzu would have us do. Ford's strengths were abundant, market domination built on inexpensive, well-built, easy-to-drive, and easy-to-fix Model Ts. But there were glaring weaknesses. Ford's products were almost completely devoid of aesthetic appeal and variation. By exploiting different brands, different models, different styling packages, GM, which still couldn't compete on price, could nonetheless appeal to different classes of car buyers. They wanted to move up from the excessively utilitarian and monochromatic Model T. To survive, it was Ford that now had to adapt to GM's innovative tweaking of its own first-mover innovations. And it's in relation to this last point about competition's dynamic and interactive nature that I think the story of the early Ford Motor Company and Master Sun's military methods track really nicely. In both 4th century China and 1920s Detroit, we see cutthroat competition between impressive combatants. Given the scale and huge expenses involved, it's no surprise that these corporations' leadership and their organization, or as the Sun Tzu puts it, command and method, made all the difference. It initially vaulted Ford past his competitors, but command and method, especially if they become pathological and self-defeating, are profoundly dangerous. That's why the Art of War's very first line warns us that the military, this vast, impressive, manpower and resource-intensive machine, is not just the key to the state's survival and prosperity, its mismanagement under poor leadership is also the state's quickest path to ruin. In our next lecture, we'll examine how the Sun Tzu general is able to leverage these leadership and organizational advantages to turn weather and terrain, environmental factors, these things ostensibly outside human control, into tools of victory.